If the widespread support for Luigi Mangione taught us anything, it's that there is a surprising number of Americans that have completely given up on the system to the point where they're ready to burn it all down. And politicians and pundits clearly don't understand why there's this revolutionary fervor in the country, and in response have tried to pearl clutch and finger wag or tone police, but that just demonstrates how out of touch they are, and those responses are making people even more mad. So if you were wondering whether or not the support for Luigi Mangione would trigger any sort of introspection among elected officials and maybe influence them to learn or adapt to the political climate to actually meet people's needs, the answer obviously is an unequivocal no. So we're left in this situation where the public's thirst for vigilante violence will inevitably continue to grow, not because they're immoral or evil or violent, but because they are desperate and view it as a necessity. And I say all this because pop star Ethel Cain made some, shall we say, interesting comments about CEOs, and people mostly agreed with everything that she said, even though what she said is admittedly pretty extreme. Now, if she said this a decade ago, it would have turned heads, but in 2025, she said something crazy, and it doesn't even really seem to be controversial, which I think tells you a lot about the climate that we're in and how bad things have gotten. So let's get to Ethel Cain's comments. So in an Instagram story, she shared a quote from Robert Reich, which reads, "Big oil buys off Congress, no action on climate. The NRA buys off Congress, no action on guns. Insurance companies buy off Congress, no action on healthcare." The list goes on and on. Money in politics is the root of our dysfunction. And as you can see at the top, she includes the hashtag blank more CEOs. Now, let's just pause here, because if you're wondering whether or not she's talking about doing this in effigy in the video game Minecraft, well, for purposes of this video, I think that does seem to be the case. I don't think she genuinely thinks people should do this, and she's probably just saying this to be edgy and for shock value. With that being said, I actually missed it. There is more to her post. She adds, "Not even trying to be reactionary or edgy or say this shit for shock value. I genuinely mean what I say." Okay then, corporations giggle at protesting. Why would anyone ever willingly come down off their throne that they've spent years building off the suffering of their fellow man? Nobody is getting visited by the ghost of Christmas future. No one is having a change of heart. It's simple. You make them fear for their lives and hit them in the only place they hurt, or nothing will ever get done. I don't see how that's an incredibly radical idea. It seems quite straightforward to me. Violence is never the answer is wrong. Sometimes it is. She concludes by saying, "The world is burning and it's clear who's holding the matches." Okay, so that's her 2 cents. Now, I personally find her comments just terrible. And I'm also beaming more thoughts about this that I have into your brain right now, so you know exactly what I'm thinking. And if you look closely into my eyes for a moment, you can really see how distraught I am by her comments. And I know you all feel the same way. But on a serious note, spontaneous acts of violence aren't going to facilitate systemic change. Obviously, if anything, it's just going to be used as a justification to take away more of our civil liberties. With that being said, if the Lord Almighty herself chooses to smite these motherfuckers, I give you permission to not be sad about that. But just put aside your feelings and my feelings about her comments and acknowledge why so many people reached this conclusion. This viewpoint doesn't just materialize in a vacuum. And it's not just Ethel Cain who believes this now. She represents a growing portion of the American population who feels like politics and governance is no longer a viable path towards political change. And I say this because when you look at the response to this story, as I alluded to earlier, the commenters were largely supportive of what she said. So we're going to look at some comments and then explore why so many people feel this way, even though policymakers are completely uninterested in finding out why the public is being radicalized to this extent. But first, we're going to take a quick break and talk about today's sponsor. If this last election taught us anything, it is that narratives are everything, and the way that news stories are framed actually affects our perception of reality, which is why I teamed up with Ground News, who's the sponsor of today's video. The independent team at the Ground News app gathers articles from thousands of media outlets to provide you with additional context about the publication's ideological slant, reliability, and ownership, and it's all backed by ratings from 3 independent news monitoring organizations. And to show you what I mean, when Mark Zuckerberg announced an end to Meta's fact-checking policy, policy. More right-wing outlets like the Ohio Star framed it as an end to, quote, censorship, whereas more centrist and left-leaning outlets characterized it as a move to appease Donald Trump. And you can also see the breakdown of the type of coverage of this story, including the bias distribution, the factuality score, as well as aggregate data about the ownership of organizations that covered it. So if being a responsible consumer of media is as important to you as it is to me, check them out at groundnews.com/humanist and use my link to save 50% off on the same Vantage plan that I use for unlimited access to all of their features. Thank you so much to Ground News for sponsoring this video. So let's get to some comments here. Now, based on what I've seen, and obviously I haven't looked at every single comment on the internet about this, but I saw a lot of people chime in with some shock that she said this, and others push back against the idea that violence can bring about change. But for the most part, people were largely supportive of her comments and even praised her for saying it, with one exception being the comment section of a conservative paper. But without further ado, let's dive in. So you had people here sharing comments from Bill Burr, who said similar things about CEOs, along with somebody chiming in saying she's not wrong. Until we get money out of politics, we cannot build a sustainable society for the benefit of all instead of the top elites. Others called her mother and shared a gif saying she's not wrong. Others saying no PR team, no media training, she's so iconic. Another person saying she ate. This person says it's crazy we live in a society where most agree with this. They've made people that disillusioned and unsympathetic. The system is so broken. I appreciate the passion, but violence isn't a growth strategy. I'm just saying if our kids can run school shooter drills every other week, the CEOs can also taste some fear of what our kids go through. Let her cook. Well, damn, can't say I disagree. The more things change, the more they stay the same. USA headed for our French Revolution era. And it's worth noting that these were replies to popular pop culture accounts like Pop Crave and Pop Base, so their followers weren't necessarily political, even though some political people saw these posts and also decided to weigh in. But with that being said, a lot of people weren't afraid to share their true feelings in the same way that Ethel Cain wasn't afraid to share her true feelings. And people were mostly supportive based on what I saw. There were a lot of folks who were kind of shocked that she said that with her full chest, as I said earlier. But for the most part, people weren't necessarily appalled by her comments. And I think that, as I said earlier, if she said something like this in 2010 or 2000, heads would turn. But now people see what she said and they're like, yeah, makes sense to me. Which is something that the government should take note of, not because I want them to surveil people, but because it speaks to how disillusioned they are with the system and their actions. And as a matter of fact, it was actually hard to find people who took issue with her comments. But I did find one, the comment section of this Daily Mail article that reported on her comments. Now, the audience here is more centrist and right-leaning, so I don't necessarily expect them to be as in agreement with her. But they didn't agree. However, the reasons why they disagreed were very different than the reasons politicians and pundits wouldn't agree with something like this. And we'll explore that in a little bit, but first, let's just look at some of the examples here. Well, if she thought she was going to have a lucrative career, it's over now. Who does she think will help guide her celebrity status? Network CEOs. I noticed she didn't criticize the music CEOs or Ticketmaster, who've completely ruined that industry and made it totally unaffordable for the average person, LOL. Now, this person misses the point because even though Ticketmaster is terrible, the Ticketmaster CEO's greed doesn't lead to people dying. So, this attempt to hypocrisy burn her just misses the point. This person adds, does that include the CEO of her singing career? Now, this person actually defended the health insurance industry, which is pretty rare, but they said, who is this nobody? Of course, she is being reactionary and aiming for edginess. It comes off as blatant stupidity. The USA does not have socialized medicine. She should go back to school and learn how the country operates. I think she's mad because she knows how the country operates. They go on and talk about how, insurance is available in varying degrees of coverage and people can do what they want. It's the illusion of choice that this person clearly fell for, but there was some pushback to that comment. This person says here, I'm so glad we have this 26-year-old to guide us through this world. How did we make it this far without her? And the rest of her ilks. Deep life knowledge. Now that sentiment right there is toxic. Disregarding somebody's opinion because they're young is just... You're part of the problem if you have this belief. Now, that is just a small sample, obviously, but there were more commenters who were attacking her because she was a nobody, which is not true. She is huge. I'm a massive fan of Ethel Cain. I just discovered her last year. She is massive. Now, there were others that were misgendering her and just generally attacking her with ad hominem attacks. But for the most part, even in more conservative portions of the internet, the response is very different than the response from, say, conservative pundits who are multimillionaires themselves. There weren't many conservatives that instinctively attacked her for endorsing violence specifically, because on some level, even these conservatives in these comment sections, they understand how violent the system is towards regular people. Whereas when it comes to elites in media, like Chris Cuomo or Ben Shapiro, when they saw the widespread support for Luigi Mangione, they were mostly taken aback by the support for violence, because even though they're rich, they're not rich because they're consequential CEOs in industries that affect people's lives. They're just loudmouths in media, but they're still rich. And as a result, they viewed it as an attack against their collective class, which is why they had that reaction. And, there's clearly a disconnect between them and the working class right-wing viewers, because to them, the pundits, the elite class, the system isn't violent because they can't perceive of it being violent, because it could never be violent to them. They have enough money to survive if their claim is denied, whereas a normal person in their audience could go bankrupt or die if their claim is denied. So, class status leads to two entirely different perspectives on this issue, and that's really interesting to see. Now, I'm assuming that people like Ben Shapiro are going to react similarly after seeing Ethel Cain's comments and, the support for her, but rather than being appalled, I want to challenge them to be curious and ask themselves how someone like Ethel Cain would become radicalized in the first place, and why so many working class people agree with her. That is a very important question. Think about it. Ethel Cain is a 26-year-old, and in her entire adult life, she has never experienced a government that is responsive to the people. For example, in 2020, we saw the George Floyd protests morph into a global call for action and for systemic change in American policing. Thousands of people in cities across the world demanded action in the aftermath of George Floyd's murder. And do you want to know what happened? Jack shit. The party in power at the time, Republicans, responded by calling for violence against the protesters. Meanwhile, police brutalized citizens with chemical weapons, and Trump privately talked about shooting them in the legs. Now, they didn't even pretend to have any interest in addressing people's demands. Instead, they were focused on suppressing their rage and activism. And then when Democrats came to power, they didn't implement the reforms activists demanded either. And one of the main calls was defund the police. And nowadays, everyone tends to talk in the past tense about the police being defunded, when in actuality, Democratic leaders around the country increased funding for police with full-throated support of the Democratic president. I mean, in a functioning democracy, when you see that level of activism in your country and around the world, and an outcry from people everywhere, and that results in just no policy change, what message does that send to people? And that's just one example. Ethel Cain is also a huge supporter of Palestinian human rights, and we've now witnessed an ongoing genocide in Gaza for more than a year. We've seen images of children being massacred, all while our government funds it and defends it. And throughout 2024, politicians in both political parties were heckled about their complicity with this genocide, and you'd think that during an election year of all times, they would at least try to placate us, and at least pretend to care about what we want. But do you want to know what they did? They gave us the middle finger. They waved the Israeli flag in our faces in front of protesters, and both parties did this. Both parties voted to increase funding for genocide, and then both parties voted to ban TikTok in a transparent attempt to hide the genocide from us. The House just overwhelmingly voted to sanction the ICC for issuing an arrest warrant for the war criminals directly responsible for this genocide. And politicians in both parties are taking pictures with those war criminals now that have arrest warrants out for them. I'm looking at you, Cory Booker. Their response to all of us has been fuck you. And these same politicians who have been arming and funding a genocide now have the nerve to scold Americans for cheering on vigilante violence while their hands are soaked in blood. It is ridiculous. And I say all this again to say that Ethel Cain never experienced a responsive government. For her entire adult life, she's witnessed an increasingly corrupt government turn a blind eye to some of the most worst crises in this country and in the world. Climate change, homelessness, healthcare, it doesn't matter how much something is really bad or how much an issue needs to be addressed. They've made it clear they are fundamentally uninterested in doing even the bare minimum to help regular people. But it's not just young people like Ethel Cain. Literally everyone has watched in horror as politicians become antagonistic towards their own constituents as things get worse, which is when they should be trying to at least pretend to be understanding, but they keep giving us the finger and spitting in our faces even more. Young people can't buy homes, yet we're blamed for not working hard enough. Unhoused people have nowhere to go, but they're blamed for cities being dirty and unsafe. And while working people suffer more and more, the politicians are enriching themselves at their expense while the world burns, and pundits are providing them with the cover to fuck us over. So rather than asking what's wrong with the peasants who yearn for violence, they should be asking what's wrong with them. They are the reason why people like Ethel Cain can say something like this and get applauded. But they have no interest in even exploring why people are so mad. They could listen and then subsequently adopt policy changes to improve people's lives if they really wanted to re-legitimize the system, but instead they're trying to reify the system by making an example out of people who challenge it through acts of violence. For example, they subjected Luigi Mangione to a ridiculous perp walk that backfired tremendously, and they arrested 42-year-old Breonna Boston for saying delayed, denied, deposed, you people are next, to an insurance agent at Blue Cross. And this is something that she said in anger because her claim was denied. She clearly was no threat to them. She doesn't even own a gun, but they wanted to make an example out of her when they should have made an example out of the insurance company who denied her claim, which is arguably an act of violence against her in and of itself. But that's not going to happen because politicians just don't represent us, period. They represent oligarchs and large multinational corporations who fuck us over. What we want is fundamentally at odds with what the ruling class wants. And things will continue to get worse because they're going to continue to govern that way, even though there are so many crises that need to be addressed. We saw that ruthless response to Breonna Boston because she's not the constituent of Florida politicians. Blue Cross Blue Shield, that's the true constituent of these politicians, which is why they treated her the way they did and let the company get away with fucking her over. And it'd be one thing if they simply didn't care about us. That would be bad in and of itself. But the problem is that they actually have contempt for the working class, as evidenced by the class warfare that they're waging against us every single year. I mean, pay close attention to all of Trump's budget proposals, because during his first term, he proposed cuts to Social Security, Medicare, and other necessary social welfare programs while calling for an even larger military budget. And Republicans already want more tax cuts for the rich. The question is how much austerity they're going to enact to pay for it. The question is, how much pain and suffering will they inflict on normal people in order to enrich themselves? The answer is, probably just enough to get you to fire off a mean tweet at them, but not enough to make you want to bust out the pitchforks, right? They fucking hate you. But that hate is mutual. And the lack of regard for our lives has culminated in this moment, where they've sufficiently made the peasants so desperate that they're actually on the verge of breaking out the pitchforks. So if you are a politician or a pundit who is shocked by Ethel Cain's comments and the subsequent response to it, or shocked by the support for Luigi Mangione, don't get mad at the people. Be mad at yourself for failing them again and again and again.